Welcome to Rossman Radio, the podcast where we dive deep into the journeys of entrepreneurs, founders, and e-commerce brands that are breaking through the noise and scaling like never before. I'm Elise, and Rossman Media is a trend-forward social media agency specializing in going viral and delivering 10x returns for the brands that we work with. Each week, I'll sit down with industry disruptors to talk about the highs, the lows, and the exact strategies that help them grow from their first sale to multi-million-dollar milestones. If you're ready to unlock what it really takes to win on social, build a community, and multiply your revenue, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it.
All right, welcome back to Rossman Radio. I'm Rob Nichols. Today I'm speaking with Maria Luisa Mendiola, the founder of Miga Swimwear, a brand that's redefining what inclusive fashion looks like. Miga creates beautifully designed swimwear in collaboration with women with disabilities using universal design to make suits that work for everyone. She's navigated some unique challenges in bringing her mission and her brand to life, and I'm excited to dive into that journey with her today. And everything in between. So Maria, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the basics. What inspired you to start Miga Swimwear, and what was the moment you knew that this idea could really make an impact?
So it all starts from my personal journey into design. I was born with a genetic condition called asphyxiating thoracic syndrome. It's incredibly rare. And I grew up in Costa Rica, and so I was wearing a swimsuit more than just the summer. It's just all year around. And every time I would wear a swimsuit, I would feel really uncomfortable about this disfigurement that I have in my feet. And so it was this kind of love and hate relationship where I loved swimwear. I loved being in the water. I would use swimwear as a tool to kind of like distract. So like the more bold textures, patterns that I can have in a bathing suit, I felt like it distracted from my feet. And so when I decided to do my master's in design at Central St. Martin's, I had this 1 year where I could focus completely on thinking about a brand that would actually flip swimwear on its head and would be all about, okay, this is a swimwear brand for people who are told that they should not be wearing swimsuits, that they should not be at a pool or be in the ocean because their body looks differently. And like, just to give you some backstory, like this was in 2016 where like the whole beach body conversation was coming up about feeling comfortable in your body. Diversities in models was coming up as well. So it was like a great time to really explore this. And as part of my master's, I got to work with burn survivors. And I knew I loved swimwear. It's just I was still in, and I knew how I had used swimwear as a tool, but I needed some clarification of if other people were looking for this. And it just came around that one of the women that I was working with reached out to her doctor and said, like, I'm looking for a swimsuit that makes me feel comfortable with these burn scars that now I have. And so I worked with her along with other women who had not only burn scars, but other conditions to create, at that point, it was ready to wear. It wasn't only swimsuits. But then as I started like narrowing in, and obviously like the passion that I had for swimsuits, it just became obvious. So 2018 is where I launched the brand. We did a Kickstarter. We raised over $10,000 through friends and family. And that's kind of how it started.
That's an amazing story. Looking back at those early days, I guess your Kickstarter campaign was a good success. How did you transition from that initial round of funding to I know that you've gotten a lot of good press. So how did you kind of transition from that starting early days to your growth period?
Yeah, actually was a really hard transition because we were still trying to figure out what our production would look like. So actually, the factory that helped me in New York do the samples for the Kickstarter was not the right partner for producing at scale. And so it was a lot about finding first the production. And, I had done my master's in design, but it wasn't in the United States. Like already like my network in the States was very limited in that way. So there was a lot of trial and error. It wasn't until I want to say late 2019 that I was connected with the right people that put me in touch with the right partners to actually get the products out the door. So there was like I fulfilled the rewards using one partner, but then I moved to production at scales to another partner. And once I had that ready, it was great. But then COVID happened, and that meant beaches, pools were closed. Overall, the consumer went from buying 2-4 bathing suits starting in March to not being certain about when they were going to go back to the beach or the pool. So it was a really difficult moment because we were exactly in stock. And I'm talking like 1,000 units, which for a small producer, it's like a lot of inventory in March 2020. So at that point, it was like, okay, so what is going on? How can I make this work? Because prior to COVID, it was the Kickstarter, it was the press that came with the Kickstarter. And even with that, we relied heavily on activations like events. I was a member of the wing in New York. And so like I would do a lot of events there. And that's kind of how we got a lot of our first customers. And then all of a sudden with COVID, we didn't have that. So then the next couple of years, I want to say 2020, 2021, it became really clear that we had to leverage Google and Facebook for us. But again, as a small company, you know, in order for these campaigns, in order for you to get clicks, you have to spend a lot. So first we ran into a problem with language. How were we defining the brand, right? We were a niche brand. We were trying to look for people who had, first and foremost, like disabilities, chronic illnesses, disfigurements, because they would understand the brand. They would understand, like, I know what it's like to have a chronic condition. I know what it's like to feel like I have to hide a certain part of my body when I go to the beach or the pool. And as we were trying to find these people using keywords like swimwear brand for people with disabilities, a swimwear brand with a cause, like we had to test and iterate a lot to see what actually brought the audience in. And many times that meant that our campaigns got flagged and got paused. And so we had all these false starts those first 2 years because we couldn't figure out what was the correct language. And then another issue that we ran into is that since it was COVID, you had all these direct-to-consumer brands that had never been in swimwear trying to get into swimwear because they were desperate trying to see what was going to sell, because the consumer, even though we had been, we received like checks from the government to spend, consumer was not spending. So, it was just this crazy moment where like our campaigns were being flagged for the wrong keywords. We were testing and iterating. And then on top of that, the actual swimwear brand was getting flooded with all these other brands that were not in swimwear that were trying to get into swimwear to get those sales. I mean, I'm talking like heritage brands that were going into swimwear that had never been in swimwear, making it even more competitive. So we're talking like a small business who's, I think in 2021, we spend $6,000, which for a small business is a lot of money to then not get that return of investment. And so we're spending that. I mean, I used to work in e-commerce where for a company that's established, 30,000 one platform, like let's say in Facebook, is nothing, and 30,000 in a day. 60K in a year for a small brand. That is, to give you an example, like that is what we spent in production in 1 year in the United States. So it's just like really crazy how those 2 years, 2020, 2021, we were trying to make Facebook and Google work for us, but we had all these hurdles.
Yeah, it's interesting when we're talking to, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, especially on the podcast today, because what we saw during the pandemic, and my God, you had the perfect storm, didn't you? But like what they had during the pandemic was all of this demand for e-commerce that hadn't existed, or at least existed in a different or less advanced way before, that the channels were having to handle. And admittedly, I don't think they were fully prepared for the demand of everyone shifting to online buying. Now, what we hear and what we see a lot of is the shift towards automation and AI. And it's the buzziest word today. It's a great tool internally to help speed up things that would normally be really time consuming. You can argue about its creative merits probably on a different podcast, but what I would say is that a lot of the support and a lot of the how the channels like Google and Meta are determining the criteria of what gets flagged and what doesn't is being offloaded onto these automated systems, which work great for a very specific type of brand. But when it comes to a brand like Miga, it's using certain keywords that Meta might flag as being, or Meta or Google might flag as being against their policies, it doesn't work. It's not a one size fits all. So I'm curious to hear, when you ran into those difficulties, you're willing to spend money, you're ready to give the channel money. How do you pivot then? You go from wanting to spend on traditional channels to not being able to make revenue on the traditional e-commerce channels that are growing rapidly during COVID. How do you pivot? How does a small brand pivot in a way that still makes you a profitable enterprise?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, not only was it clear that those channels were not the right fit, it was also clear that like it was time for us to focus on other aspects of the brand that maybe we're not going to get flagged. And we also discussed too how, and I think it's important to note that like how moderation has changed. Whereas before we were being flagged for discriminating the audience that we were trying to reach, we had to remove content that it was on our product pages that said something of the like of, this is the Lydia swim bottom. It's inspired on Lydia's story with ulcerative colitis. We had to remove all of that. So essentially taking out the mission of our brand in order for us to be able to market ourselves. And then since that was not working, what we ended was like, okay, what other aspects of the brand can we market? And so essentially not leading with our mission, but instead leading with our swimsuits are made in the United States. Our swimsuits are made of recycled fishnets like fabric. Our swimsuits have SPF 50. Like what other aspects of our brand could we lead with? And that was a right choice at the moment. This was our strategy in 2022 that led to a partnership with Target. We got a lot of write-ups at that point. We did not pay any of these write-ups. This was just people who found our brand and our brand spoke to them. So the likes of write-ups in EcoCult, they tried one of our bathing suits and they gave an honest review, and that put us in a write-up about top sustainable brands to look out for. That helped. I think also the beauty of universal design is that because we included a lot of people in our design. So a request from a lot of customers was that we create a swimwear short with pockets. Again, pockets being great for any kind of medical equipment that you needed to carry. And that actually was one of like our best sellers, and it was written up in a digital queer magazine, which was awesome. Once again, like this is the whole premise of universal design. A very niche community requests something and it benefits someone else. So that was kind of like all of this organic press that we started getting in 2022 that was incredibly helpful. And what even we do to this day is it's that kind of press, but then also we still mostly just do Google keywords, and it's for our own brand. So we work with two big retailers. We work with Target. We sell through Target and through Macy's, obviously also through our website, migaswimwear.com. But on top of that, we have, these partnerships with Target and Macy's, and that's where you see a lot of like that traffic coming in. So that also meant for us that we had to partner with these big retailers, which again, in 2020, that was the last thing that I would have done because there was all this push with direct to consumer. But direct to consumer doesn't work unless you have a crazy amount of funding behind it, right? In the likes of away suitcases, like that kind of funding. So I think I've derailed a lot from your question, but just to see how many times we've pivoted is a testament of how retail is always changing. And I'm very curious as to, with AI and the pendulum swinging towards Facebook not moderating a lot of their content, where does that leave their marketing practices, and where do we fit in that?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and I think that the extreme shifts from from one year to the next even have been kind of jarring for a lot of brands. I know that a lot of there are basic medical privacy related concerns related to Google and Meta, but also the content moderation policies, like you mentioned, have changed and even weakened, especially when it concerns protecting certain communities. Even just as recently as this year. So it in order to stay on top of those kind of changes, I would liken it to, for any one of our listeners or any brand who's ever tried to sell on Amazon, or who's ever tried to sell in one of the bigger e-commerce sandboxes. You guys know how many hoops you have to jump through just to be able to be listed on those platforms, meeting all of these requirements: return percentage, review quality, average complaints about the actual like packaging. Everything is really designed for this very much like a square peg in a round hole. But like, if it works really well for a very specific type of product, but they don't often make it for anything that deviates even the littlest bit from there. And I think the same thing applies to those channels. And what it ends up being is just a full-time job. And for a lot of small brands, you guys can't afford to have one person sitting there dedicated to going back and forth with Meta over what is and isn't allowed, or appealing to Google and doing it in the right way so that you don't get flagged again by the same automated process. So I think that's where I know that on our side, a lot of managing those channels is just actively trying to explain and get through our own via their own regulations, via their own rules. So it's I think the shorter answer to that is it requires constant management, which it shouldn't, especially if the channels would like to make money from their clients. But I think that it's an interesting dilemma that people are in today, because the alternative is to be very fortunate and get good press, which I think that you guys have actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think can you talk a little bit about, I know in the wake of being overly moderated by Meta, you kind of had some of your own marketing that sort of used that to your advantage.
Absolutely. So this whole conversation about being discriminated against, right? Like being in the fashion adaptive world. And then you have these big players that on one side are saying, and we're talking about like around the time of like 2020, Black Lives Matters, all of this going on. They're saying, we want to be supportive, we want to do all of this. And then on the other side we're small businesses catering to people with disabilities that can't even market because of your algorithm. So on that end, we were actually included in this write-up for Vogue Business, talking about our experience. And then and for this particular article, I think Google did not even want to comment. And then a year later, Google reaches out to me asking us if we want to be part of a campaign about how digital ads are super important for businesses, which they are. So this was like an opportunity that came about. I think it was 2024, where we were included in this campaign with other New York businesses, and we were actually on the New York Times because of it. So I think it's just really interesting, because these companies are so massive that on one end they could be getting criticism, and then the same people that are criticizing them they're being asked to go on their campaigns to basically say how awesome they are and how integral they are, because they are, right? That's like the takeaway here, that even though like it was very difficult for us to advertise, and was it the best use of our funding at that point? Probably not. But I'm glad I tried it, and Google's not going anywhere. So I think for me as a business owner, it's like, oh, the free press, I'm all for it, because we have used Google. We still continue to use keywords. It was just, that moment where you're like, wow, like the one reason why we're not able to get more sales is this company, and now this company wants to give this press somewhere else. Like, we took it.
Yeah, it's that I think sometimes they can't see the forest for the trees, or they get so big that one part of the company doesn't talk to the other. Right now, we talk to a lot of brands
Exactly.
that really want to be on TikTok Shop. TikTok Shop is a completely different set of staff and department than normal TikTok. So it's more about having to decode all of this language and internal company bureaucracy in order just to be able to use the channel, which can be frustrating for a lot of businesses. But I think it's an interesting approach to it in that Google definitely wanted, and if you look at it optimistically, you would say that Google wanted to work with brands like you, but incorrectly or mistakenly made it harder for you to work with them.
Exactly.
The other side could be that they didn't care enough to make a system that works for every brand. But I'm glad that you guys were able to actually take advantage of that and use it, to boost yourselves up. Going forward, what do you see as the future for Miga? What do you see in the next, 12 months? Are you prioritizing any channels in particular, or is anything working really well for you right now that you think would be valuable for other small businesses?
I would say that we'll probably continue doing Google keywords. And our partnerships with big retailers are really what's driving the majority of our conversions at the moment. So just continuing to build on those relationships. We are always looking for more stockists that really understand our mission and, are looking for swimsuits that are made in the United States. I was really, with the whole tariff fiasco at the beginning of the year, I was looking forward to, really standing out as US made. The importance of us being produced in the United States. We, are fortunate enough to produce in LA with incredible, talented people. And, that's just something that we just look forward to continuing to do, making sure that we're keeping manufacturing alive in the United States, even as a small company that we are. And yeah, continuing to work with our partners and finding more, because it all works downstream, right? If we're able to get more partners, more sales, we're able to continue to do bigger orders and work with these factories. So that's my goal for the next 12 months.
Nice. Well, we wish you nothing but success. I think your story is really inspiring, and thanks for sharing that with us today, Maria. I think a lot of people listening are going to be inspired. I hope not discouraged. I hope inspired by your story, and I think that a lot of people are going to identify with the fact that as a small brand that doesn't fit into a specific idea of what the channels have for a product, you're still able to find success in your own way on your own terms. So thanks so much for joining us. And for anyone interested and who wants to support Miga, you can visit migaswimwear.com. That's MIGA swimwear.com.
Thank you so much.